He never imagined the earth could swallow a man whole. One moment he was walking along the ridge, following a familiar trail he had taken dozens of times before, and the next, the ground beneath him simply collapsed. There was no warning, no crack, no tremor, nothing but the sudden sensation of weightlessness as the world dropped away beneath his feet. He didn't even have time to scream. He just fell, tumbling into darkness, his hands clawing at empty air while rocks scraped past his clothes and skin. When he finally hit the bottom, the impact knocked the breath from his lungs and filled his head with a dull, pulsing ring. He tried to move, but pain exploded across his ribs. Dust floated in the stale air, and above him the circle of daylight he had fallen through looked impossibly small, like a cruel reminder of the world he was no longer part of. That was when he realized no one knew where he was, and he had no water. All he had left was his will to survive. As the shock faded, fear rushed in to take its place. He forced himself to sit up, every muscle trembling, and studied the cavern around him. The sinkhole was deeper than a two-story building, its limestone walls jagged in some places and smooth in others, as though carved by centuries of invisible water that no longer flowed. The air was heavy, unmoving, and his throat already felt dry from the dust he had inhaled during the fall. He shouted for help, expecting the sound to echo upward, but the silence that followed felt like a weight pressing against his chest. No response, no footsteps, no sign of life. His phone lay dead in his pocket, its screen shattered beyond use. He checked his pockets, nothing that could save him, no snacks, no water, not even a lighter. The absurdity of it struck him. A simple afternoon walk had now become a fight for his life. He pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain slicing through his side, and ran his hand along the nearest wall. The rock felt stubborn, hardened by time, with no meaningful footholds within reach. Climbing out wasn't possible, not yet, maybe not ever. His mind raced through survival priorities: shelter, warmth, rescue, and water. Shelter was automatic. The sinkhole itself served as one. Warmth wasn't a threat for now. Rescue depended on whether anyone noticed he was missing. But water was the enemy. A human being can survive weeks without food, but not more than a couple of days without water. And dehydration had already begun its slow, merciless attack. He leaned against the cold limestone and closed his eyes, forcing his breaths to slow. 48 hours, he thought. I need to make it at least 48 hours. Yet even as he formed the thought, doubt crept in. He searched every inch he could reach, dragging his battered body across the uneven ground. Each corner brought new disappointment: dry dust, hard stone, and heavy silence. He smelled minerals, something metallic and earthy, like the scent after rainfall, but there was no moisture anywhere. Tilting his head back, he stared at the thin circle of sky above him. It felt unreal that sunlight existed up there while he fought against the tightening grip of thirst down here. He shouted again, harder this time, until his throat burned with the effort. Nothing. Not even a distant echo. The silence felt alive, creeping into his thoughts, whispering that he was already forgotten, that this place would swallow his voice just as it had swallowed his body. He refused to believe it. He couldn't afford to. As the hours crawled by, the light above dimmed until the sinkhole became a gray, tomb-like chamber. Every swallow now brought pain. His lips cracked when he tried to wet them with his tongue, and the pulsing ache in his ribs intensified with every movement. He lay on the cold floor, staring up at the shrinking glow of fading daylight, thinking of his family, of unfinished conversations, of moments he still hoped to live. A strange calm washed over him, urging him to close his eyes and rest. But he wouldn't. Survival required more than strength. It required a decision, a promise to keep going even when the body begged to quit. So he forced himself upright once more, trembling, determined to survive the next minute, then the next hour, then the next day. He didn't know how, but he clung to the one truth that mattered. He was not going to die in that hole. Before we dive deeper into this true survival story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment below where you're watching from, your country, and your city. Your support helps stories like this reach more people around the world. Now, what happened to this man in the heart of that remote forest was not just a fall into a sinkhole. It was a brutal confrontation with the raw, unforgiving limits of human endurance. He had left home that morning expecting nothing more than a peaceful hike, something he often did to clear his mind after long weeks of work. He told no one the exact trail he planned to follow, something he would later regret deeply. When the ground swallowed him, it didn't just trap his body. It stripped away every layer of security he thought he had. Suddenly, he was just a man alone in the dark, with shattered ribs, no water, and no certainty anyone would even begin searching for him. The forest where he fell was known for its rugged beauty, towering trees, narrow trails, and long stretches of untouched wilderness. But it was also known for something else, hidden cavities beneath the surface. Geologists had warned that the region was full of unstable limestone formations perforated by tunnels carved by ancient underground rivers. Sinkholes were rare, but not impossible. He had heard those stories before, but like most people, he dismissed them as distant possibilities, things that happened to someone else. Everything changed in a heartbeat. The moment the earth gave way beneath him, he crossed a line between the predictable safety of daily life and a silent world where instinct ruled. In that world, his only companions were darkness, pain, and the slow ticking of time as his body dried from the inside out. Long before rescue efforts even began, before anyone realized he was missing, he was already fighting a battle most people underestimate: dehydration. When the human body is cut off from water, the decline is swift and merciless. Within hours, the throat tightens, the tongue swells, and the mind begins drifting into confusion. He could feel it happening. The dust he inhaled during the fall had coated his mouth with a bitter dryness that seemed impossible to escape. The air inside the sinkhole was stagnant, heavy, as though it had not been disturbed in decades, and every breath seemed to draw more moisture out of him. He tried to calm himself, repeating the simple logic of survival training he had once seen in documentaries: conserve energy, stay mentally present, slow your breathing, focus on what you can control. Those were rules he had never imagined he would need, not until the earth took him prisoner. What he didn't know was that the clock had already begun working against him. Miles away, people assumed he was enjoying a long hike. His phone's last known location was an old cell tower far from where the collapse happened. Even if someone started searching, they would likely look in the wrong direction. He couldn't climb out. The walls were too smooth, too high. And even if he tried, his injured ribs made every movement agonizing. He had to stay calm, had to wait for darkness to pass, had to hope that the following day would bring some miracle, perhaps rain, a sound from above, or the slightest vibration of footsteps. But the silence made one truth inescapable. If he wanted to survive, he would have to outlast the very thing that kills more lost hikers than hunger or cold. He had to outlast thirst. As the hours turned into a full day, he began to understand the real enemy was not the darkness, nor the injury, nor even the isolation. It was time itself. Every minute without water pushed him closer to the edge. His body was weakening, but his mind refused to surrender. He thought about the life waiting for him above, his unfinished plans, his family, the conversations he kept postponing, the promises he still intended to keep. These thoughts became his anchor, the thin thread pulling him back every time he felt his consciousness slipping. He didn't know how long he could endure, but he knew why he needed to. That single reason, life, became sharper, more precious, more urgent with each passing hour. And so, in the depths of that ancient cavern, surrounded by silence and stone, he made a decision that would shape the next 48 hours of his existence. No matter what happened, he would fight. The first night in the sinkhole settled over him like a physical weight, sealing him inside a darkness so complete it almost felt alive. As the last sliver of daylight disappeared above him, the world turned into a cavern of muted shapes and shifting shadows. He tried to stand, but the pain in his ribs forced him back to his knees. Every breath came shallow and sharp, and he realized that even breathing too hard might worsen the internal bruising. He needed to be strategic, not just with his movements, but with every choice he made. He pressed his palm against the cold limestone, grounding himself. The air smelled ancient, untouched. He had never been claustrophobic before, but in that moment, he felt the walls closing in around him. He whispered a prayer not loud enough to echo, just enough for his own trembling mind. He didn't know if anyone could hear him, but he needed to believe something could. As the darkness fully claimed the cavern, the temperature dropped. Not enough to freeze him, but enough to seep into his bones, tightening every muscle. He dragged himself toward one of the cavern walls, hoping to find a small crevice where he could sit without the pain becoming unbearable. The wall wasn't smooth, but neither was it jagged. It had a strange, polished texture, as if shaped by flowing water ages ago. He settled in the shallowest indent he could find and hugged his knees close to his chest. The position wasn't comfortable, but it conserved warmth. His breathing slowed, and he forced himself to listen, really listen, to the environment around him. Silence. Not the silence of nighttime forests where wind whistles and insects sing. This was the silence of a sealed tomb, a kind of quiet that swallowed sound instead of reflecting it. His throat burned with a dryness he had never felt before. It wasn't just thirst. It was as though the dust embedded in the stagnant air was scraping his insides with every breath. He licked his lips, but they only cracked further. He tried swallowing slowly, attempting to trick his body into thinking it was receiving moisture, but the effort only heightened the ache in his throat. Already, dehydration was setting in. The human body loses about 1 liter of water just by breathing each day. Down here, breathing felt like a punishment, every inhale draining him faster. He needed to find moisture anywhere, even the faintest trace. With effort, he crawled across the cavern floor, his palms gathering dust and grit. He reached into darker corners, hoping maybe condensation had formed somewhere. But all he found was bone-dry stone. The pain in his ribs made crawling nearly unbearable. At one point, a sharp stab forced him to pause, clutching his side as stars danced in his vision. It was then he noticed something odd. A faint, almost musical trickle. Not water, sadly, but small pebbles shifting somewhere above him. He looked up. The rim of the sinkhole was so high that even in the faint moonlight he could barely distinguish its edges. He wondered if the fall had destabilized the rock. Was more going to collapse? If the sinkhole widened, he might get buried alive. The fear crawled across his skin like electricity. He pushed himself closer to the center of the cavern, away from the areas where small stones occasionally clicked against the ground. He didn't have the strength to run, but he could at least avoid the most dangerous spots. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The absence of light made time lose all meaning. He found himself talking aloud just to stay connected to reality. His voice sounded strange in the cavern, swallowed before it could spread. "I'm still here," he whispered at one point. "I'm still alive." Saying the words grounded him. He thought of his family, his mother who always worried too much, his younger sister who sent him messages he often forgot to answer, and his father who taught him how to love hiking but never warned him what the wilderness could truly take. He wished he had told them exactly where he was going that day. A simple message could have changed everything. Now, he had no idea when, if ever, someone would start looking. With no water and no possibility of sleep, his mind began drifting into moments of clarity and fog. He wasn't hallucinating yet, but thoughts came fractured. He imagined footsteps above him, the crunch of boots on leaves. He imagined a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He imagined voices calling his name. But every time he held his breath and listened, reality met him with suffocating stillness. His body trembled, not from cold, but from anxiety tightening around his chest. He tried to steady himself with slow breathing. A survival documentary echoed in his memory, one line, spoken almost casually. "Your mind will try to kill you long before nature does." Now he understood. In this cavern, isolation wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. Eventually, exhaustion forced his body to rest, even if his mind refused. He leaned against the wall, letting the stone support him. The silence became a strange companion, and his thoughts drifted unwillingly back to the moment of the fall. He replayed the sound, earth giving way, the shock in his lungs, the helplessness as he plummeted. He remembered reaching for a branch that broke under his weight. He remembered the helpless scream trapped in his chest. What haunted him most was the instant before he hit the bottom, a moment suspended in time when he truly believed he might die. And now, hours later, that belief was still hovering over him, pressing into him with the same weight as the earth above. At one point, he pressed his ear against the rock wall, hoping to hear something, anything from the world above. But there was nothing, not even the distant rustle of trees or animals. The sinkhole felt like a cocoon separating him from life. He wondered if anyone had passed along the trail after his fall. Would they notice the broken ground? Would they stop? Would they care enough to look? The answer was a painful uncertainty. Most hikers stuck to known paths, and the place where he fell wasn't part of any official route. He had chosen it precisely because it was quiet and isolated. Now that choice felt like a curse. As the endless night dragged on, he forced himself into problem-solving mode. He needed a plan for morning. If his body continued drying out at this rate, he wouldn't last the full 48 hours. He inspected the cavern once more, using his hands to feel every surface he hadn't touched before. Then he noticed something, a faint draft brushing against his fingertips. Air movement. That meant there might be an opening somewhere, even a tiny one. He followed the sensation, dragging himself across the ground despite the pain. It led him toward one of the darker corners. He couldn't see much, but the air there was cooler. If water existed anywhere in this cavern, it would be near airflow. The discovery didn't save him, but it ignited a spark of hope, small but vital. By the time dawn finally crept into the sinkhole, the first pale glow illuminating the stone walls, he was shaking from exhaustion and thirst. His lips were cracked, and every swallow felt like sand scraping through his throat. But he had survived the first night. That alone was a victory. As the light slowly filled the cavern, he examined the spot where he had felt the cool draft. It wasn't an exit, not even close, but a narrow fracture running along the rock. Maybe it collected condensation overnight. Maybe it held a droplet he could use. His survival now depended on fragments, tiny chances, slivers of possibility. And as he stared at that crack in the stone, hope, thin, fragile, but real, began to fight its way back inside him. Morning light did not feel like rescue. It felt like exposure. As the sun rose above the forest canopy, thin rays filtered down into the sinkhole, revealing the harsh reality he had faced in the darkness. The cavern looked even more desolate in daylight, dry, cracked, unwelcoming. He blinked against the brightness, his eyes gritty from the sleepless night. Every muscle ached, especially his ribs, which throbbed with a dull, persistent sting every time he inhaled too deeply. He pushed himself upright, wincing as pain spread across his side like a heated blade. But he forced himself to stand. Surviving meant movement, and movement meant action. He scanned the walls again, studying every crack and groove with fresh determination. Now that daylight had returned, he needed to know exactly what resources, if any, this cavern had to offer. His first goal was the narrow fissure where he felt the cool draft during the night. Crawling toward it felt like dragging his body through shards of glass. Every shift of weight ignited sharp pain. When he reached the crack, he pressed his fingers inside, feeling for moisture. At first he found nothing but dry stone. His heart sank. But then, farther inside, the pad of his index finger touched something cold. Not wet, but damp. A trace. A whisper of moisture. He withdrew his hand and stared at the thin smear on his skin, too small to even call a drop. Still he lifted his finger to his lips and sucked, desperate for relief. The taste was metallic and faint, but it eased the burn in his throat for a few seconds. It wasn't enough, not even close, but it told him something important. Water existed somewhere in the rock. He just needed to coax it out. He began scraping at the crack with a broken piece of stone he found on the ground. The fragment acted like a crude tool, widening the fissure bit by bit. Dust fell onto his hands and face as he worked. The labor was slow and draining, and his strength was fading faster than he wanted to admit. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not because he was warm, but because his body was desperately trying to regulate itself. Every drop lost was a drop he couldn't afford to waste. The irony was agonizing. He paused often, resting his head against the wall as dizziness washed over him. But he couldn't stop, not when the faint hope of moisture was right in front of him. Hope was the only currency he had left. Hours slipped by as he worked at the fissure, though he had no way of measuring them. The light overhead shifted gradually, changing the color of the stone from a cold gray to a warm gold. Occasionally, the ground trembled faintly, not enough to signal new collapse, but enough to remind him that he was inside a living structure shaped by time and pressure. The trembling made him uneasy. Sinkholes sometimes expanded. Sometimes walls gave way, and if that crack widened too much, the entire formation could shift. Yet the only alternative was dehydration. He had no choice. Survival demanded risk. He continued scraping, even when his hands began to blister and bleed. The pain, strangely, felt grounding. It reminded him that he was still alive. Eventually he leaned back, exhausted, staring at the small cavity he had managed to create. It wasn't much, barely a shallow indent in the stone. But as he watched, he noticed something incredible. A tiny droplet formed in the upper crevice, slow and glistening. His breath caught, it swelled, trembled, and finally slid downward, landing near the center of the cavity. He reached for it immediately, touching the damp stone with his lips. The droplet was barely enough to notice, but the psychological impact was enormous. If one droplet could form, more might follow. Perhaps at night, when temperatures changed, condensation would increase. The cavern wasn't giving him water. It was offering a possibility. And possibilities were the fuel of survival. The discovery energized him. With renewed determination, he widened the cavity slightly, careful not to destabilize the rock. His arms and shoulders trembled from exhaustion, and his throat felt like it was tearing every time he swallowed. He rested occasionally, forcing himself to breathe slowly and evenly to conserve moisture. He remembered reading once that panic accelerates dehydration. Calm was crucial, but calm was difficult. His mind drifted to the world above. The wind rustling through trees, the scent of pine, the sound of distant birds. Those simple sensations felt like luxuries now. He wondered if anyone had started looking for him. Did anyone know he was missing? Or would this hole become his grave, discovered only by chance years later? By midday, the heat above intensified, and the sunlight striking the upper rim of the sinkhole felt mocking. He tried shouting again. His voice cracked on the first attempt, weak and hoarse. The sound barely rose halfway before dissipating. He tried again, louder, and pain ripped through his ribs. He clutched his side, gasping. Shouting was too expensive, too costly in breath, effort, and precious moisture. He had to save his voice. He couldn't afford to waste a single drop of water his body still held. Instead, he cupped his hands around his mouth and exhaled slowly, visualizing moisture returning to him. It didn't, of course, not in any physical way, but the visualization kept him mentally anchored. The long hours of daylight forced him into introspection he hadn't sought. Thirst had a way of stripping life down to its core. He thought about the choices that had led him here, choosing solitude over communication, nature over safety, silence over routine. He thought of the times he ignored calls from loved ones, thinking there would always be more time. Now he wasn't sure there would be. He regretted not telling his sister he loved her the last time they spoke. He regretted not calling his mother after her surgery. In this cavern, every regret felt sharpened. Every mistake echoed louder than the silence around him. Late in the afternoon, his body could no longer sustain extended effort. His muscles trembled uncontrollably, and his vision blurred at the edges. He lay on his side, pulling shallow breaths through dry lips. His tongue felt swollen, crowding his mouth. He tried licking the stone wall again, hoping to find more moisture. It tasted like dust and iron. Desperation tightened in his chest, but he refused to give up. The human body could endure 3 days without water. Under ideal conditions, these were far from ideal. But still, he had survived the first night. He had found a potential source of moisture. He had not lost hope. Not yet. As the sun dipped and the cavern dimmed, the temperature dropped again. Relief washed through him as the heat faded. Cold meant condensation. Condensation meant droplets. And droplets meant survival. He crawled back to the fissure and positioned himself beneath it, ready to catch any moisture that formed overnight. The stone pressed cold against his cheek, and the darkness crept in once more. But this night was different. He wasn't just waiting, he was watching, hoping, enduring. The battle against thirst was far from over, but he had found something vital. Something even more precious than water. He had found direction. The second night began with the faintest glimmer of salvation shimmering on the stone above him. By the time the next stretch of hours crawled over him, the man could feel his thoughts slipping into places he didn't recognize. Dehydration wasn't just attacking his body anymore. It was tearing at the edges of his mind. His mouth felt like sandpaper, every breath scraping against his dry throat, as though he were inhaling dust instead of air. He pressed his back against the cold limestone wall, trying to steady himself. He knew that if he allowed panic to take over, his chances of survival would plummet. But staying rational was becoming harder and harder. The line between the physical pain in his ribs and the psychological weight of isolation was blurring. He needed something to anchor himself, something to keep him from drifting into the fog swallowing his senses. The sinkhole, which at first had been simply a terrifying trap, had now become a strange and oppressive universe of its own. The silence was no longer empty. It was loud, almost crushing. It wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket, amplifying the smallest sounds, his heartbeat, his shallow breaths, the faint rustle of pebbles shifting beneath him. At moments he imagined he heard echoes that weren't real. Distant footsteps, someone calling his name, water dripping just out of reach. Each time, he forced himself to stop and listen carefully to differentiate hallucination from reality. But it was getting harder. The mind, when starving for hope and hydration, begins to create its own world, and he feared that soon he wouldn't be able to tell the difference. He tried to piece together what time it might be. The faint light above shifted subtly, but down here, hours blended into one another without mercy. His watch had stopped during the fall, the glass cracked, the hands frozen. He had no way to measure how long he'd been trapped. Only the steady escalation of thirst and fatigue gave him clues. He estimated that at least a full day had passed since he first hit the ground. Maybe more. His sense of time was evaporating faster than the moisture in his body. He wrapped his arms around himself to conserve what little energy he had left. He needed to think. He needed to plan. But his mind was drifting in and out like a weak signal, struggling to stay connected. At one point he closed his eyes and tried to imagine running water, a river, rain, even the taste of ice. But the images only tormented him. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, and the thirst became a physical agony that made his entire body pulse. He remembered reading somewhere that the human body can survive 3 days without water, sometimes a little more depending on conditions. But that was in normal circumstances, not in a dust-filled pit with injured ribs and almost no humidity in the air. The dryness here was accelerating everything. Each exhale felt like he was giving up the last remnants of moisture he had left. And with that realization came a cold, creeping fear that perhaps he wouldn't even make it to the 48-hour mark. Determined not to let the fear consume him, he forced his thoughts toward memories that could keep him grounded. He tried recalling the last meal he had eaten, the last conversation he'd had with someone, the last moment he had felt the sun on his face. He pictured himself walking freely along the trail, breathing fresh air, listening to the rustling leaves. He clung to those memories as though they were lifelines in a storm. But even they began to distort under the weight of dehydration. He found it harder to visualize faces, harder to remember voices. His mind wandered into strange, fragmented imagery, colors and shapes that didn't make sense, sounds without origin, flashes of places he had never been. He opened his eyes quickly, forcing himself back into the present, back to the stone walls, the cold ground, the reality he was fighting so hard not to lose. He realized he needed to do something, anything, to keep control of his thoughts. So he started talking aloud, even though his voice came out raspy and weak. He spoke to himself about ordinary things, what he would do if he got out, the tasks waiting for him at home, the trip he had planned for the following month. The sound of his own voice grounded him. It reminded him that he was still here, still conscious, still fighting. At one point he even tried to make a joke, though it came out as a broken whisper. But talking wasn't just an attempt to stay sane. It was a strategy. If his voice suddenly changed, if he started slurring or losing track of what he was saying, he would know his mind was slipping too far into dehydration-induced delirium. His voice became a compass, a fragile lifeline keeping him oriented. But eventually even talking became exhausting. The dryness in his throat made every word painful, as though he were scraping his vocal cords with sand. He resorted to whispering, then finally to silent mouthing of words. He knew he couldn't push his throat too far. He needed to preserve what little strength he had left. So he turned his focus inward again, scanning the walls around him. The sinkhole walls weren't just smooth limestone after all. There were tiny cracks, faint marks of erosion, and places where the rock had crumbled slightly. He studied them carefully. If there was any chance of climbing, it would be through one of those imperfections. But every time he tried lifting himself, even a few inches, the pain in his ribcage shot through his chest like fire, forcing him back down. Escape through climbing was impossible. He began to explore the ground instead, using his fingertips to feel around for anything that might help, stones, pieces of root, anything. But the ground was bare, stripped by years of water flow long before he ever fell. He found nothing useful, not a single tool, not a single object that could change his situation. The emptiness of the pit seemed almost symbolic, as though the earth had swallowed him intentionally and left nothing he could use to fight back. But he refused to accept that. He dragged himself along the perimeter, even though every movement sent shocks of pain through his ribcage. He needed to stay active, needed to keep searching, needed to give himself the illusion of progress, even if there was none. Because the moment he stopped trying, the sinkhole would win. As the temperature began to drop again, signaling that night was returning above ground, he felt his body trembling, not from cold alone, but from a mix of exhaustion, fear, and the creeping edge of delirium. Shadows stretched across the walls as the last traces of light faded. Night heightened every sound, and the darkness felt thicker than before. He hugged his knees, trying to conserve warmth, and forced himself to breathe slowly. He knew that the second night would be far more dangerous than the first. His body was weaker now. His mind was fragile, and with no water, he was approaching the edge where hallucinations, confusion, and unconsciousness could strike without warning. He whispered to himself again, repeating a single phrase, "Stay awake, stay awake, stay awake." But despite his effort, there were moments when his vision blurred and his consciousness drifted. He fought to bring himself back each time, clawing mentally toward awareness. Hours passed like a dream he couldn't control. At one point, he thought he saw a faint glimmer of light in a corner of the pit, as though a hidden tunnel were glowing. He blinked hard, and it vanished. Another hallucination. He knew he was nearing the breaking point, yet even in that fragile state, he held on to one truth. Morning would come again. And with it, maybe, just maybe, there would be a sound from above, a chance of rain, or the faintest sign that someone was searching. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to gather strength. The fight was far from over, and as long as he kept his mind tethered to reality, he still had a chance to survive the next critical hours. When the first traces of daylight returned, they did so quietly, almost timidly, as though unsure whether they should enter the silent grave where he lay. The man sensed the shift in brightness before he fully opened his eyes. He had drifted in and out of consciousness through the longest night of his life, but he refused to surrender fully to sleep. Sleep, in his condition, was a dangerous luxury. It could slide too easily into unconsciousness, and unconsciousness into something worse. As the light deepened, he slowly forced his swollen eyelids open. Pain radiated through his ribs as he moved, but at least he was awake. That alone was a victory. He was entering his second morning inside the sinkhole, and although every muscle in his body begged him to stop fighting, he knew this day would be the most critical one yet. The world looked different now. The faint morning light revealed details he hadn't noticed before. Small patches of moss clinging stubbornly to the shaded corners of the limestone wall, subtle textures in the rock, tiny insects moving near the base of the pit. Each sight felt almost surreal, as though his brain was compensating for the hallucinations of the night by exaggerating everything real. He studied every inch of the pit again, not with the energy of a man searching for escape, but with the desperation of someone clinging to the smallest hint of change. If he could find something new, something he had missed, something that could help him, it would mean he hadn't wasted the last day. But the sinkhole remained what it had always been. Silent, indifferent, and impossibly steep. His lips were cracked and bleeding now. The dryness stung like fire, and every attempt to swallow felt like dragging a blade through his throat. Dehydration had reached the point where his skin felt tight and hot, and his thoughts came slower, heavy as though weighed down by sand. He looked up at the sky, hoping, praying, that clouds might gather. Even a drop of rain would feel like a miracle. But the sky above was painfully clear, a pure, merciless blue that held no promise of relief. The sun would soon climb high again, heating the air at the top of the pit, but down here the cold stone still clung to him. He was trapped between extremes, with no comfort on either side. Still, he refused to let despair overtake him. Not now. Not when he had already survived this long. He knew he needed to conserve energy, but he also knew that remaining completely still would let his mind slip back into the shadows of delirium. He forced himself to move, inch by inch. He pressed his palm against the wall and attempted once more to pull himself upward, even knowing the pain would be excruciating. And it was. The moment he applied pressure, his ribs screamed, and he collapsed back down. The agony stole his breath, and for several minutes he couldn't even inhale deeply enough to steady himself. Tears welled in his eyes, partially from pain, partially from the crushing realization that escape through climbing was physically impossible. He had always believed that pure determination could overcome almost anything. But now, he had to face the truth. His willpower wasn't the problem. His body simply couldn't do it. He lay on his side, breathing shallowly, waiting for the pain to subside. He reminded himself that surviving wasn't always about strength, it was about endurance, patience, and clarity. If he burned energy recklessly, he wouldn't last another day. He shut his eyes and listened carefully, hoping for any hint of life above, a bird's wings flapping, wind brushing through branches, distant footsteps. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a faint rustle, a vibration, maybe even a voice. He held his breath, straining to hear better. But the sound faded, swallowed by the vast stillness. Another trick of dehydration? Probably. But he clung to the idea that help might not be as far away as he feared. It was the only hope he had left to grip. More hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, carving slowly shifting shadows across the walls of the pit. He watched them as though they were old friends performing a familiar routine. He realized how quickly isolation could reshape the mind, how the simplest movement of light could become something meaningful, something almost comforting. But when midday arrived, the heat above became intense, and the warm air drifted downward, filling the pit with a suffocating heaviness. His breathing grew faster, more strained, and he could feel the last traces of moisture leaving his body. His heart pounded unevenly, his muscles trembled with every shift, and his vision began to blur at the edges. He sat upright, leaning heavily on the wall, forcing himself to stay conscious. The worst thing he could do now was slip away into sleep. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He pressed both hands to the ground, feeling it tilt beneath him as though the whole world had begun to rotate. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, and for a terrifying moment he felt like he was floating. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but shapes and shadows twisted into strange forms. He saw water that wasn't there, streams running along the walls, droplets gathering over his head. He reached out instinctively, his fingers clawing at nothing. The hallucination vanished in an instant, leaving him staring at bare rock. Panic tightened his chest, not from the illusion, but from what it meant. He was approaching the point where his mind could no longer distinguish reality from his own desperate fantasies. He knew he had to regain control. He focused on his breathing, slow, steady, intentional. He forced himself to count, even when the numbers tangled in his thoughts. He dug his fingers into the dirt to remind himself of what was real. He whispered fragments of memories. His home, his routine, the trail he had walked. Anything that grounded him. Slowly, painfully, the fog began to lift. The world steadied, though it remained dim and sluggish. He leaned his head back against the wall, exhausted by the effort of simply staying conscious. But he had won another small battle. One more moment of clarity in a place designed to take it from him. Afternoon gave way to evening. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the pit like dark fingers reaching for him. The second night was coming, and he knew it would be worse than the first. His body was weaker, his mind unstable, his throat burning with thirst. Darkness would bring cold, hallucinations, and the risk of slipping into unconsciousness without realizing it. He braced himself for the coming hours, gathering what little strength he had left. He told himself over and over that the night was just another obstacle, one he had survived once before. The key was to stay awake, to keep the mind sharp, to fight the quiet seduction of sleep. But he was no longer sure if he could do it. As the last light vanished from the sky, the man curled into himself, hugging his trembling arms close to his chest. He whispered words without meaning, syllables meant only to keep him alert. The cold settled in, making his teeth chatter despite the dryness of his mouth. He closed his eyes for a moment, but only a moment, and forced them open again. Night had come for him once more, and if he wanted to live through the next 12 hours, he would need more than strength. He would need his mind, whatever pieces of it he could still control. He stared into the dark, willing himself not to fade. The fight was entering its final phase, and he could feel it. The second night was beginning, and his life hung by the thinnest thread of determination. Night descended like a heavy curtain, swallowing the pit in absolute darkness. The man felt its presence instantly, not merely as the absence of light, but as a living force pressing against him. He curled tighter, trying to preserve what little warmth remained in his failing body. Every breath was a shallow rasp, each movement a tremor of exhaustion. His mind drifted dangerously close to the edge of unconsciousness. He forced his fingernails into the dirt, scraping at the ground just to feel something beneath him. The pain kept him tethered to reality. He whispered broken words, anything that could keep his awareness flickering. He knew that if he slept now, even for a moment, he might never wake up again. The cold deepened, seeping into his bones. His body shivered violently, but even that involuntary effort consumed precious energy he didn't have. He tried to control it, clenching his jaw, tightening his muscles, even though each contraction sent shocks of pain through his damaged ribs. He pressed his forehead against his knees, breathing slowly, forcing himself to stay present. But the darkness began to play tricks on him. He saw vague shapes moving across the walls, shadows that swayed as though alive. At times he thought he sensed someone standing beside him, but when he turned, there was nothing. The hallucinations were more vivid now, more insistent. His mind, starved of water and light, was unraveling thread by fragile thread. He fought back by repeating a single phrase, "Hold on until morning." The words became a rhythm, a mantra, a thin rope pulling him away from oblivion. He repeated them silently until his lips could no longer form the sounds. He imagined the warmth of sunrise, the possibility that someone might pass by the area in daylight, the chance that help, though improbable, was still possible. But the night stretched endlessly. Time dissolved. He had no way to measure how long he'd been awake or how close dawn might be. The only truth was the pain in his ribs, the fire in his throat, and the crushing weight of dehydration threatening to shut down his body one organ at a time. Suddenly, a wave of weakness washed over him so completely that he thought his heart had stopped. He collapsed sideways, his body too drained to catch itself. The world spun violently. Darkness moved like liquid, swirling around him until he wasn't sure if he was lying down or floating. He reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against cold stone, grounding him. He clung to that simple connection, the roughness of the rock, the certainty that it was real. He dragged himself back into a sitting position with agonizing slowness. Every breath felt like a battle, every blink an effort. He could feel himself slipping, his mind pulling away from consciousness like a tide receding from shore. Then, somewhere above, a faint sound echoed, a distant rustle. He froze, unsure if it was another hallucination, another trick from his dying senses. He held his breath, listening with every ounce of strength left in him. For a moment, there was nothing. Then it came again, a soft crunch, like footsteps on dirt. His heart lurched painfully in his chest. The sound was real. It was distant but real. He tried to shout, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. He gathered his remaining strength and pressed his back against the wall, using it to lift himself to his feet. His legs shook violently. He inhaled and shouted again, louder this time, a broken, guttural cry that tore at his throat. The footsteps paused. Then they began moving, this time directly toward the sinkhole. Panic and hope surged through him at once. He screamed again, though the effort made his vision go white around the edges. Above him, a shadow leaned over the rim. A voice followed, distant but unmistakably human. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried urgency. Relief flooded him so powerfully it nearly knocked him off his feet. He reached upward weakly, his arm shaking uncontrollably. The person above shouted something, then disappeared briefly from view. Moments later, the silhouette returned, this time holding a flashlight, its beam piercing the darkness and illuminating the man like a spotlight on a stage. The rescuers shouted instructions down to him, but his mind couldn't process all of it. He heard fragments. "Hold on. Stay awake. Rope. Help is coming." He nodded weakly, though he wasn't sure they could see him from above. He watched as they secured a rope system, their movements quick and practiced. The beam of the flashlight danced around the walls, revealing the true depth of the pit, and just how impossible his situation had been from the start. A harness was lowered toward him, swinging gently as it descended. When it finally reached the ground, he stared at it for several seconds before his brain understood what it was. He tried to attach it himself, but his fingers failed him. One of the rescuers called down instructions step by step, and somehow, through sheer determination, he managed to fasten the straps around his torso. As they began lifting him, his body screamed in pain. The pressure of the harness pushed against his bruised ribs, and he gritted his teeth to keep from crying out. He rose slowly, swaying like a broken marionette. The walls passed by him, inch by inch. Every foot gained felt like an hour. Halfway up, dizziness overwhelmed him again. His eyes rolled back, and he nearly slipped into unconsciousness. But the rescuers noticed immediately. They halted the ascent, shouting at him to stay awake, to keep breathing, to look toward the light. He forced his eyes open, focusing on the beam of the flashlight, as though it were the only thing tethering him to life. Finally, his hands reached the rim. Strong arms grabbed him and pulled him over the edge. The first breath of open air felt like a miracle. Cool wind brushed against his face, the scent of earth and vegetation flooding his senses. He coughed violently, his lungs struggling to adjust after so many hours of stale air. The rescuers lifted him onto a stretcher, wrapping him in blankets, placing a mask over his face, checking his pulse. Voices swirled around him, urgent, relieved, frantic. He caught fragments of their conversation. How someone had reported seeing his abandoned backpack, how search dogs had picked up his trail, how lucky he was to be alive after nearly 48 hours without water. He wanted to respond, to thank them. But all that came out was a faint whisper drowned beneath the noise of their rescue efforts. As they carried him away from the edge of the pit, he turned his head slightly, looking back at the dark void that had nearly become his grave. It seemed smaller now, less monstrous, yet still haunting. He realized how close he had come to becoming a silent part of the earth, another lost traveler swallowed by the wilderness. But he hadn't surrendered. Even at his weakest, even when his mind began to fracture, he had held on, not out of strength alone, but out of a deep, instinctive refusal to disappear. As the rescuers lifted him into the helicopter, the world around him blurred. He closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to drift, not into the darkness he had fought against, but into safety. The battle was over. He had survived the impossible. In the quiet aftermath of his escape, as rescue teams wrapped him in blankets and checked his vitals, the man could barely grasp the weight of what he had just survived. 48 hours without water, 2 days trapped in the cold, crushing silence of a sinkhole no one knew existed, and a battle against the kind of fear that swallows a person whole. Yet, standing there under the fading afternoon light, he felt something he never expected. Gratitude, not for the suffering, not for the terror, but for the clarity that had emerged inside him during those impossible hours. He realized how fragile life truly is, how quickly the ground beneath us, literally or metaphorically, can crumble without warning. And in that fragility, he found a new respect for every breath, every heartbeat, every quiet moment he had taken for granted. Over the following weeks, the memory of the sinkhole stayed with him, not as a nightmare, but as a reminder. He remembered the way darkness forced him to listen to his own thoughts, the way thirst sharpened his awareness, the way desperation pushed him to create tools and strategies he didn't know he had the courage to attempt. Most of all, he remembered the moment he chose not to surrender, the moment he understood that survival is not only a physical act, but a decision made deep within the soul. He returned to the outdoors eventually, slower and more observant, no longer rushing through trails but studying them, respecting them, honoring them. What once was a simple hobby had become sacred, almost spiritual, because he now understood what it meant to stand alone on the edge of life and push back. And though he seldom spoke openly about those hours trapped beneath the earth, he carried their lessons everywhere. He learned patience. He learned humility. He learned that even when hope seems too small to hold, A single decision, to move, to try, to rise, can change the ending of the story. His escape wasn't just survival, it was transformation. And anyone who heard his testimony could feel the truth woven into it. That strength is not born in comfort, but in crisis. That faith grows where fear tries to root itself. And that sometimes, life gives us moments that break us only so we can rebuild ourselves stronger, wiser, and far more alive than before.